Berlin, July 20th, 1944. The air vibrated with sirens and suspicion. Inside the wolf's lair, deep in the pine forests of East Prussia, a faint drizzle hissed against the barbed wire. Guards whispered rumors, an explosion, a betrayal, a name that should never have been spoken aloud. Adolf Hitler lived. Barely shaken, his uniform torn by splinters, he paced the conference hut like a man carved from fury. The July plot, the attempt by his own officers to end the war, had failed. But its failure lit a darker fire than any Allied bomb. From that hour, the Führer began to see ghosts in every uniform. Every hesitation became conspiracy. Every silence guilt. The heart of the Wehrmacht began to rot, not from bullets or hunger, but from the poison of doubt. In a side corridor, a young adjutant named Karl Reinhardt stood rigid, clutching a sealed envelope that trembled in his hands. His orders were simple: deliver it to Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, recovering at his villa in Herrlingen. But Reinhardt could read the unspoken truth. The envelope was not a message of trust. It was a verdict. The storm that followed was silent. Rommel, the desert fox, hero of North Africa, opened the letter beneath a gray afternoon sky. He read once, then folded the paper with care. Outside, an SS officer waited beside a black Mercedes. Rommel turned to his wife Lucia and said quietly, "Tell our son I did my duty." 2 hours later, the radio announced his death from sudden illness. Inside the wolf's lair, Hitler smiled for the first time in days. But somewhere between those pine trees and the burning cities beyond, the Wehrmacht's soul cracked. Reinhardt rode back toward Berlin, the sound of train wheels merging with the echo of what he had just witnessed. He was 26, loyal, proud, and for the first time, uncertain of what loyalty even meant. In Berlin, Goebbels' propaganda machine moved fast. Posters of Rommel appeared overnight, branding him a patriot's martyr. Yet officers whispered the truth in corridors. The Führer had killed his best general. The paranoia spread like smoke. Generals spied on generals. Field Marshal Model watched Guderian. Guderian distrusted Keitel. Even secretaries reported on each other to the Gestapo. The Wehrmacht, once the most efficient army in Europe, began to feed upon itself. By autumn, Reinhardt was reassigned to an intelligence post near Warsaw. His superior, Colonel Drexler, a thin man with hollow eyes, warned him, "Remember, Lieutenant, loyalty today means survival tomorrow." The colonel's office smelled of fear and cheap tobacco. Files were stacked high, lists of questionable officers, and signed letters, anonymous accusations. One by one, men disappeared after midnight interrogations. It was here Reinhardt noticed the pattern. The denunciations carried the same code markings. R2SS/I, the insignia of Himmler's RSHA, the Reich Main Security Office. The SS was planting seeds of distrust inside the army itself. But proof was deadly. So Reinhardt stayed silent, watching names vanish into oblivion. Winter crept across Poland. The Eastern Front buckled under Soviet artillery, yet Hitler refused to allow withdrawals. When generals argued, he called them cowards. When divisions collapsed, he blamed defeatists. By December, entire armies were fighting phantom enemies, while the real enemy gathered at the gates. In January 1945, Reinhardt received a new assignment: accompany a supply convoy to Minsk and deliver encoded dispatches to Army Group Center. The journey would take 3 nights by rail through frozen forests where partisans prowled. On the second night, the train halted abruptly near Białystok. In the distance, a whistle, then the sharp crack of gunfire. Partisans attacked the rear cars. Soldiers scrambled into the snow, rifles flashing in the darkness. Reinhardt ducked beneath shattered glass as bullets tore through the cabin. A senior officer beside him collapsed, a crimson bloom spreading across his chest. Clutched in the man's fist was a small black ledger. Before dying, the officer pressed it into Reinhardt's hands and rasped, "Keep it, trust no one." When dawn came, the attackers were gone. The convoy burned quietly amid the snowdrifts. Reinhardt opened the ledger inside a derailed carriage. Its pages listed dozens of Wehrmacht officers, each name marked with a red cross and the notation "unto Beobachtung," under observation. Next to every name was the same RSHA code. He understood then. The SS was not merely investigating traitors, it was manufacturing them. For 2 days, he hid the ledger beneath his greatcoat, haunted by what it meant. Every accusation, every disappearance, engineered. The army's collapse was not just happening, it was being orchestrated from within. At a forest clearing near Baranovici, He dug a shallow hole beneath a birch tree and buried the ledger in the frozen soil. "For Germany," he whispered, "not for him." That night, smoke from the front lines drifted across the horizon, orange and endless. Somewhere beyond those flames, the Soviet guns thundered closer. The Reich was dying, but not by the hands of its enemies. In Berlin, the Gestapo compiled new lists. In the Wolf's Lair, Hitler ranted about invisible conspirators. And in the quiet snowbound fields of the East, a single soldier carried the knowledge that the Wehrmacht's greatest threat was not the Allies, nor Stalin's tanks, but its own reflection. He would soon learn that secrets, once buried, never stay buried for long. As February faded, Berlin's nights grew quieter, but only on the surface. The streets still smoked from air raids, yet what truly burned was unseen: the fever of suspicion. The cafes where officers once met for coffee now stood half empty, their windows darkened. Every conversation seemed to pause when boots clicked by. Every doorway hid an ear. Reinhardt returned from the east to find the capital colder than the front. His uniform smelled of train smoke and scorched timber, but the stares that followed him through the corridors of the War Ministry made him feel like he'd brought back infection. Rumors spread that the Gestapo had new informants inside the Wehrmacht's own headquarters. He watched once proud commanders forced to salute SS guards half their age. He saw gray-haired generals wait outside offices for permission slips signed by men who'd never fought a day at the front. The balance had shifted. The army no longer served the Reich, it served the fear of one man. Every map conference ended in shouting. Hitler blamed sabotage for every defeat. When Guderian warned that the Russians would soon reach the Oder, Hitler pounded his fists on the table and screamed that the general staff were all liars. "If the front collapses," he shouted, "it will be because of traitors in uniform." No one dared answer. After each outburst, officers vanished. A telephone call. A knock at midnight. A car that drove east instead of west. Reinhardt began keeping his own small notebook, recording what he saw and heard. Not for revenge, but for memory. Somewhere inside him, the soldier's sense of duty had warped into something quieter. The need to remember the truth before it was erased completely. By March, the SS controlled the railways. They decided who received food, who received ammunition, who was simply forgotten. Entire units were stranded because an SS depot lost their transport orders. Some commanders resorted to bribery, trading weapons for fuel from black market depots run by the same men who accused them of disloyalty. In East Pomerania, Hitler's insistence on no retreat turned a tactical withdrawal into slaughter. When survivors staggered back toward the Vistula, Berlin's bulletins still called it a heroic stand. The soldiers reading those reports laughed without humor. Reinhardt didn't laugh. He saw what laughter could cost. He met Drexler again in Berlin one gray morning, in a cafe stripped of glass and curtains. The colonel looked thinner, his eyes bloodshot. He leaned close and whispered, "They've started turning on themselves now. SS investigating SS. The walls will eat them all." 2 days later, Drexler's office was sealed. The official reason: suspected defeatism. That night Reinhardt walked the riverbank by the Spree, the black water carrying pieces of burned paper and ash. He wondered how many of those floating scraps were names, erased like Rommel's. The city hummed with the noise of destruction, distant guns, collapsing masonry, the moan of sirens that no one bothered to answer anymore. Above it all, radio towers still blared promises of victory. He passed a group of schoolboys in Hitler Youth uniforms, barely 14, practicing with wooden rifles. Their instructor shouted about duty. Their faces were thin, pale, hungry. They shouted Heil Hitler, with the voices of children pretending to be men. Reinhardt couldn't look at them long. He turned a corner and saw posters pasted over posters, the same face layered a dozen times. Rommel, the hero of the Reich. The lie still being told months after his murder. The paper flapped in the wind, tearing itself away from the wall. Reinhardt stopped. For the first time in months, he let himself feel the weight of it, all the lies, all the vanished men, all the silence. He thought of the ledger buried under the birch tree in Poland. Snow would be melting now. Maybe the ground had already given it up to the spring. He imagined someone finding it, a farmer, a Russian soldier, anyone. Someone who might open it and finally understand what had been done from inside these walls. He prayed, not to God but to history, that the book would survive him. By early April 1945, Berlin was a fortress in name only. Bridges were wired for demolition, civilians digging trenches in parks. Yet Hitler still spoke of counterattacks and miracle weapons. His circle had grown smaller, tighter, more desperate. Himmler plotted with the SS to secure his own peace. Goebbels rehearsed speeches no one would hear. Inside that shrinking world, Reinhardt waited for orders that never came. He sat in a half-empty office under flickering lights, surrounded by maps that no longer meant anything, listening to the city crumble beyond the windows. And in that silence, a thought began to take shape, one that terrified him more than the artillery. What if this was the plan all along? What if the war wasn't meant to be won at all, but to purge every rival until only one power remained standing inside Germany's ruins? He couldn't prove it. Not yet. But the pattern fit too well. Every victory had been followed by betrayal. Every loyal officer by an accusation. Every success by a convenient failure. The Wehrmacht had not simply been defeated. It had been dismantled piece by piece, its pride hollowed out until all that was left was obedience. Reinhardt thought of Rommel again, of the way he had folded that paper, of the calm in his voice. I chose the soldier's way. Perhaps Rommel had understood before anyone else what the rest refused to see. That night, Reinhardt wrote a single sentence in his notebook before extinguishing the lamp. The Reich is devouring its own heart. The words stayed on the page, black against yellow paper, trembling with the vibration of distant guns. He didn't know then that those guns were Soviet artillery, already less than 50 miles away. He didn't know that in 2 weeks the streets outside his window would be unrecognizable. He didn't know that his own name was about to appear on one of those SS lists, marked not under observation, but with a cross. He only knew that the thing called Germany was dying, not as a nation conquered, but as a body poisoned from within. And as he closed his notebook, the last air raid siren of that night began to howl over Berlin like an animal mourning its own reflection. Berlin, February 1945. Snow fell like ash over the city's ruins. The once glorious capital of the Reich had become a ghost. Windows were blacked out, bridges cratered, and the sky was never fully dark. The fires on the horizon saw to that. Inside the Chancellery bunker, the air stank of fuel and damp cement. The walls were sweating. Telephones rang without answers. Maps on the tables no longer showed battle lines, only fantasies drawn in pencil, arrows of hope on paper already curling from the heat. Hitler sat hunched at the head of the table, one trembling hand flat on the map. His pupils were pinpoints. His voice rasped as he read reports no one believed. Steiner will attack from the north, he said, and crush them here. There was no Steiner army left to attack. The officers around him nodded anyway. No one corrected him anymore. In that room, truth had become the most dangerous weapon of all. The shadow operation. At the same time, in a quieter wing of the RSHA building on Prinz Albrechtstrasse, Heinrich Himmler's inner circle drafted what they called Operation Krone. Its purpose: seize full military control once Hitler was gone. The plan required the Wehrmacht to fail, spectacularly. Only a total collapse could justify the SS assuming emergency command authority. Every setback, every delayed order, every broken supply chain was another step closer to their goal. The SS had learned long ago that bullets were not the only way to destroy an army. Paper could do it faster. They sent false orders disguised as OKW communications. They intercepted fuel shipments meant for panzer divisions and redirected them to their own armored corps. They replaced experienced officers with fanatics who would obey Himmler, not the high command. And as the front shrank, the paranoia grew. Officers began to burn their own correspondence before sleeping. Messages were sent twice, once through official channels and once by courier, just in case the first copy was edited. Sometimes both arrived changed. Reinhardt's return. Karl Reinhardt had been reassigned again, this time to Army Group Vistula, one of the Reich's last defensive formations, commanded by a man Hitler barely trusted but desperately needed, Heinrich Himmler himself. Reinhardt's orders were vague. Liaison duties. In practice, that meant running between SS command posts and the remnants of Wehrmacht staff, carrying messages that contradicted one another. One night near Stettin, he delivered an order from Himmler demanding that a corps advance toward Soviet positions. The corps commander, a weary general named von Mellenthin, read it and shook his head. "We have no tanks left," he said softly. "They burned out 2 days ago." Reinhardt said nothing. The general tore the paper in half. "Then tell him," he said, "that we advanced and died." By dawn, Soviet artillery had found them anyway. Reinhardt saw what had become of the army he once believed in, Columns of boys in mismatched uniforms, rifles without bolts, officers arguing over which imaginary division they belonged to. The SS controlled the rail lines, the police, the fuel. The Wehrmacht had maps and memories. When he returned to Berlin to report, the city was almost unrecognizable. Tramcars lay overturned like carcasses. The Tiergarten was filled with anti-aircraft guns pointed at a sky that already belonged to someone else. In an underground office, Reinhardt waited to see General Bergdorf, the same man who had once handed him Rommel's death order. Bergdorf was drunk, his eyes red, his desk covered in half-empty glasses. He looked up at Reinhardt and laughed without humor. "Still alive," he muttered. "Then you haven't been useful enough." He leaned forward. "Tell me, Lieutenant, where do your sympathies lie now? With the army? With the SS? Or with the Americans, perhaps?" Reinhardt stood silent. Bergdorf waved him off. "Don't answer. It's safer that way." That night, Reinhardt knew his name was probably on a list somewhere. Maybe in a folder stamped R2SS/I, maybe already crossed out. He began to plan his own escape, not from the front, but from the web closing around him. The hidden ledger. In the last days of March, Reinhardt received a coded message from an old contact in logistics. "Meet at Tempelhof, midnight. Bring what you buried." He froze. No one else should have known about the ledger. At midnight, the airfield was half ruined. Hangars gaped open, concrete cratered from bombs. A single lantern burned in the corner of a maintenance shed. The man waiting there was not his contact. It was an SS major, black coat, calm smile, gloves immaculate. "Lieutenant Reinhardt," the major said, "we've been looking for you. You were carrying certain materials last winter. Sensitive materials. Where are they?" Reinhardt kept his face blank. "I don't know what you mean." The major nodded, as if expecting that. "Of course. Sometimes memory fails us. But don't worry, we'll help you remember." He stepped aside. Two soldiers entered. They searched Reinhardt's satchel, his coat, his boots. They found nothing. When they left, the major leaned close enough for Reinhardt to smell the faint cologne beneath the smoke. "You're loyal," he whispered. "I can see that. Loyalty is expensive these days. Be careful who pays for yours." Then he walked away into the fog. Reinhardt left Tempelhof with one thought echoing in his head. The ledger had not been forgotten. Someone in the SS still wanted it silenced. The battle within. By April 1945, the Wehrmacht was no longer an army. It was a rumor. Orders contradicted each other hourly. One message from Hitler demanded counterattack. Another from Himmler ordered withdrawal. Entire formations vanished between those two signals. In East Prussia, soldiers starved waiting for supplies that never came. In the West, bridges were blown before friendly units crossed them. The enemy was not the Allies anymore. It was confusion. Reinhardt rode with a motorized column toward Kustrin, watching trucks run out of fuel 20 kilometers from their destination. Officers fought over who would claim the last barrel of gasoline. Some pulled pistols. One lieutenant shot another over a jerrycan. Nobody stopped him. At dusk, they heard distant cannon fire, not Russian but German. SS artillery had mistaken them for deserters. Reinhardt helped drag wounded men into a ditch as shells tore the road apart. When it ended, half the column was gone. He looked at the horizon and realized he no longer knew which direction Berlin was. Later, he reached a field headquarters where dispatches piled knee-high on a table. He opened one. It ordered a unit to attack north. The next ordered the same unit to defend south. Both carried Hitler's signature. The officer in charge laughed until he cried. "This isn't a war," he said. "It's suicide written in triplicate." Speer's secret council. 2 weeks later, whispers spread through the surviving staff. A secret meeting, called not by generals but by Albert Speer, the Reich's architect, now head of armaments. The meeting would decide whether to continue following Hitler's orders or end the war before Germany itself ceased to exist. Reinhardt was invited not as a participant, but as a messenger. He arrived at a dim apartment in Dahlem where blackout curtains muffled the light of a single lamp. Around the table sat 5 men, a field marshal, 2 colonels, an industrialist, and Speer himself. Their faces were gray from exhaustion. Speer spoke first. "Gentlemen," he said, "we are obeying the commands of a man no longer sane. If we do not act, there will be nothing left to rebuild." The field marshal leaned forward. "And if we act, we'll hang." Speer looked at him. "We'll hang anyway." They planned to send envoys to the Western Allies, to surrender without Hitler's knowledge. They believed it might save civilians from the coming firestorm. Reinhardt listened in silence, realizing this was the second great betrayal he had witnessed. The first against Rommel, now one against the Führer himself. But this time, betrayal might mean mercy. When the meeting ended, Speer handed him a sealed packet. "Deliver this to the industrial office on Vossstrasse. No one else." Reinhardt took it without a word. As he stepped into the cold night, he saw a shadow at the corner, an SS observer lighting a cigarette. Their eyes met briefly. He knew then the conspiracy was already compromised. The order of fire. 2 days later, Reinhardt was summoned to the chancellery again. The corridors echoed with shouts. Officers argued openly. Hitler had discovered fragments of Speer's plan. The Führer's rage shook the bunker. "Traitors," he screamed. "They want to deliver Germany to the enemy." He ordered Nero Befehl, the scorched earth decree. Every bridge, every factory, every power plant to be destroyed. "If I fall," he said, "Germany falls with me." That was the moment the war ended, even if the fighting continued. Reinhardt felt it in his bones, the sound of a nation turning its weapons inward. He spent that night walking through the chancellery's rubble-strewn garden, hearing the faint rumble of artillery drawing closer. The trees were leafless, the fountains dry. In a cracked marble basin lay fragments of a statue, an eagle without wings. He wondered what would be left to rebuild. He wondered if history would ever understand that Germany had not been defeated by enemies, but by the jealousy, fear, and rivalry of its own creators. As dawn came pale and cold, he wrote the last entry in his notebook. When men begin to fear each other more than the enemy, a nation dies from the inside first. Before we move to the final act, take a moment. If stories like this help you see how pride, paranoia, and power can destroy even the strongest armies, then share this video, like it, and subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends. Drop a comment below telling me where you're watching from, Toronto, Berlin, Manila, Lagos, and keep history alive with your voice. Berlin, April 26, 1945. The city bled smoke. Buildings that had stood for centuries now leaned like broken teeth. Artillery thundered from the east in constant rhythm, a drumbeat announcing the end. Beneath the streets, in tunnels filled with flickering light and diesel fumes, soldiers stumbled through rivers of mud that had once been sewers. They carried no flags, only exhaustion. Above them, the last empire of the Reich was collapsing floor by floor. The Reich Chancellery had become a tomb lit by bare bulbs. The maps on the walls were lies drawn in red grease pencil. There were no fronts anymore, only pockets of silence shrinking toward the center. Inside the bunker, Hitler refused to leave. He dictated imaginary counterattacks to divisions that no longer existed. He still believed that Steiner's phantom army would appear. The men around him pretended to believe too, because pretending was safer than truth. They stood in a world where loyalty had outlived reason. Reinhardt had been ordered into Berlin to assist final communications. In reality, he had been summoned to witness the Reich's death. The city he entered was unrecognizable, every street a trench, every doorway a bunker. He saw civilians carrying rifles without bolts, teenagers in SS armbands crying as they dragged ammunition crates too heavy to lift. He passed a hospital where nurses tore Red Cross flags into bandages. He reached the chancellery at dusk. The once polished marble halls were streaked with soot and blood. Guards slept on the floors with rifles across their chests. The smell of kerosene mixed with mildew and fear. A clerk pointed him down a stairwell to the lower level. The air grew hotter as he descended. The corridor walls pulsed faintly from distant explosions. At the bottom, a heavy door opened into the map room. The first thing he saw was Albert Speer. The architect looked nothing like the photos, hollow-cheeked, hands shaking from lack of sleep. Around him, a few officers argued over evacuation routes that no longer existed. Speer handed Reinhardt a folder sealed in wax. Inside were copies of correspondence, proof of the secret meeting, proof of the attempt to negotiate peace. Evidence that could have spared lives, if it hadn't already reached the wrong ears. Reinhardt knew what carrying it meant. Whoever held it next would not live long. Outside, the Soviets were less than 2 kilometers from the Tiergarten. The air quaked with artillery. Every blast shook dust from the ceiling. Rumors spread through the bunker that Himmler had fled. Others said he was negotiating with the Allies. The guards whispered that Goebbels had his family sleeping in the same room where he kept a pistol. Everyone had become their own enemy. Reinhardt moved through the corridors, watching officers burn files faster than they could read them. Piles of paper, the entire machinery of the Reich, turning to gray ash. Somewhere in that fire were all the names that had ruined men's lives, the lists, the reports, the ledgers. And yet, one ledger remained buried beneath a birch tree far from here. He thought of that book often now, wondering whether the snow had melted enough for it to breathe again. On April 29th, word spread like a tremor through the bunker. Mussolini was dead, executed by his own people. For a brief second, silence filled the hallways. Then Hitler's laughter echoed through the concrete, brittle, almost human. He called it justice. That night he dictated his last testament. He blamed his generals, his ministers, his people. Everyone but himself. He appointed new ones to replace the dead, the missing, and the traitors. He still signed his name with a trembling hand. Outside, the Soviets were within sight of the Brandenburg Gate. Reinhardt stood in a doorway watching officers carry gasoline cans down the corridor. They said it was for the generators. He knew it wasn't. When the first shot echoed from Hitler's chamber the next day, no one moved. They all knew what it meant. They had been waiting for that sound. The second shot followed a moment later. Eva Braun. Then the smell of fuel. Flames consumed the garden above. The bunker fell silent except for the crackle of burning history. Reinhardt did not stay to see the rest. He took the folder Speer had given him and slipped into the U-Bahn tunnels. They stretched for miles beneath Berlin, half flooded, half collapsed, echoing with distant screams and the rumble of approaching tanks. He walked past bodies lying in shallow water, past children clutching toys, past soldiers still wearing medals pinned to rags. His boots splashed quietly through the darkness. He carried with him the truth, the proof that the Wehrmacht had not simply fallen, but been dismantled from within by the rivalry of its masters. Somewhere behind him, the Soviets were already entering the city. Somewhere above, red flags would soon replace eagles. He kept walking. Days blurred. Nights had no meaning underground. The tunnels were full of refugees, families huddled around candles, officers without insignia, nurses carrying wounded men they no longer called soldiers. At one junction, Reinhardt paused to rest. He leaned against a wall painted with a faded railway map. Across the passage, a young boy no older than 16 watched him. The boy's uniform was SS black, but his hands were empty. Reinhardt reached into his coat and pulled out a single cigarette, his last. He handed it over. The boy took it, nodded once, and vanished into the dark. In that brief moment, Reinhardt understood that Germany's future would belong to ghosts like that boy. Not soldiers, not heroes, just survivors carrying silence where belief used to be. On April 30th, the guns above grew quieter. The Soviets were everywhere now, yet the city still refused to surrender. The smell of burning fuel drifted down through the tunnels. Reinhardt reached the old Stadtmitte junction and found a ladder leading to the surface. He hesitated. Then he climbed. When he pushed open the hatch, the night air hit him like a wave. The city was a sea of fire. Whole districts glowed red against the sky. The Brandenburg Gate stood like a skeleton against the smoke. He started walking west, past wrecked trams and craters, stepping over wires and fallen statues. Somewhere beyond the river lay the American lines. If he could reach them, he could tell what had happened. The truth of how rivalry and paranoia had destroyed the Wehrmacht long before the Allies arrived. But he never reached them. In the confusion of surrender, Karl Reinhardt vanished. Some claimed he was captured by the Soviets, executed in a cellar before he could speak. Others swore they saw him weeks later in an American uniform, working as an interpreter. One rumor placed him on a ship bound for Argentina. Another said he walked into the ruins one night and never came out. Years later, Allied intelligence found references to a missing German officer who had carried documents from Speer's office. Documents that disappeared from every archive. They found nothing else. But buried in a declassified OSS report from 1946 was a final note, scribbled by an analyst. If authentic, these papers suggest internal sabotage directed by the SS against the Wehrmacht. The collapse of German command may have been deliberate. No further investigation was ordered. History moved on. The ruins of Berlin were cleared, rebuilt, renamed. Streets that once shook under tanks now echoed with trams again. Children played where bunkers had been. The world looked forward, pretending to forget. Yet the question lingered, whispered by historians, buried in archives, murmured by those who had served and survived. Was the Wehrmacht truly defeated by the Allies, or by the poison of its own pride? Perhaps the answer still lies somewhere under that birch tree in the east, inside a little black ledger, waiting for someone brave enough to dig it up. Until then, the story remains unfinished, a warning carved into the bones of history. No army, no nation, can survive when its greatest enemy lives within its own walls. If stories like this remind you how power, fear, and pride can destroy even the strongest empires, then don't let this one fade. Share this video. Hit the like button to keep the algorithm from burying history. And before you go, subscribe to WW2 Frontline Legends and tell me in the comments where you're watching from: London, New York, Warsaw, Johannesburg, Manila, or Lagos. I read every single one, because every voice keeps these forgotten truths alive.